welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Managing Wildlife in the American West, presented by Aaron Bott. Aaron is a wildlife biologist who's been working with NatHab since 2017. It's great to have you with us today, Aaron. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. I'm really excited to be talking about the management of wildlife. It's kind of a misnomer. We're going to be talking about wildlife in the American West, which is where I'm from, and I have a lot of experience working out here. But managing wildlife and the topic that we're gonna cover today really applies to wildlife everywhere in the United States. So if you are a citizen of the United States, I encourage you to really pay attention. And at the end of this presentation, I'm actually gonna give you a little nudge to participate in wildlife management locally. And if you are not living in the United States but are tuning in, I encourage you to find out how wildlife is managed in your country and find out how you can become involved in conservation and management at large. Really quick as an introduction, I'm a wildlife biologist. I work with state and federal agencies here in the West. My family has lived in the Intermountain West for 7 generations, so it's an area of the world that I'm very familiar with. I care a lot about this place. I care about the wildlife and its history, and I'm excited to share with you some of my experiences. Again, because of my vocation here in the American West, I've elected to use my examples taken from the states that we have out here, from the Northern Rocky Mountains, from the Intermountain region. But everything that we're going to talk about really applies to wildlife management and conservation throughout the United States at large. So please realize that everything that we're going to talk about is applicable to every state, whether it's Florida, New Jersey, Nebraska, California. Please realize that, and I hope that you can take some new things away with you at the end of this. I work primarily with large carnivores, and so large carnivore management is my primary interest. I have given a few different presentations with Natural Habitat Adventures over the last few months regarding wolf management, as well as grizzly bear management and cougar management and conservation. And I've also given a presentation on large carnivore management and conservation, which if you've seen those, I'm going to kind of bounce some of my my thoughts and some of my examples off of those previously given presentations. If you haven't seen them, then perhaps I would recommend the large carnivore conservation presentation that was given a couple months ago as something else that you might be interested in. To get into it, wildlife management is an interesting field. Management gives the impression of a hands-on or an involved process of decisions, which some people might be uncomfortable with, and I can appreciate that, but in a few slides I'll explain why it's referred to as wildlife management. But essentially, for millennia, humans have been interacting with other species on the planet. And those interactions have been good, and sometimes they've been challenging, particularly since most of our societies have adopted an agrarian type of lifestyle with livestock. Our domestic animals have come into conflict with wildlife on many different levels, whether it be carnivores competing with us for livestock, or for herbivores competing with our domestic livestock for grazing lands. These conflicts have risen and fallen throughout countries all over the world for millennia. But we're going to be talking again about the American West and the United States and its wildlife management specifically. To begin with, I know it's Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, wherever you're from, but I'd like to dispel the Eden myth really quick. Humans at large, we've been living in North America for tens of thousands of years. and we've been a part of the landscape, and we've been a factor on the landscape. When Euro-Americans first began to settle here in what is now the United States, they didn't find an Eden, which is sometimes what we like to say in our popular mediums, but rather we found a continent that was full of civilizations and peoples that had been living here for millennia, and they had been living off the land. They'd been coexisting with wildlife and other species. And there's a common misconception that Euro-Americans were the only peoples who ever had an impact on wildlife populations. That's not the case. We know from fossils and from archaeological evidence that the peoples living here did have an impact on their wildlife, on the habitats of the wildlife, on the topography of the landscape. And I want to dispel some of those notions really quick that, again, when Euro-Americans first landed here in the Americas, they found pristine, untouched landscape. That wasn't true. People have always been involved with the natural world wherever they've been. Humans are a part of the natural world. Then to jump into it and to talk a little bit more about how the United States manages wildlife, I'd like to first mention the public trust doctrine, which is a civil law of Greek and Roman origin. The public trust doctrine essentially recognizes that the public has a right to natural resources like air and water and land and wildlife, and it requires a sovereignty to hold in trust these resources for the public. So all the way back into the classical age of the Greeks and the Romans, and then re-emphasized with the Magna Carta in England, and then popularly recognized here in the United States in the 1840s. All wildlife, all natural resources belong to the common, to the people at large. And that's something that's really cool and really special, because that hasn't been the case for civilizations or for countries all over the world. With some societies, the wildlife or the water or the vegetation belongs to a landowner, and that has kind of ostracized other peoples from accessing or appreciating those species of wildlife. But here in the United States, very early on, we set up a system of government that recognized that the public, everyone, had a right to wildlife, to appreciate it, to utilize it, to cherish it, to conserve it. And that's something that's pretty spectacular. And because of this public trust doctrine, everyone, no matter who you are or where you're from, everyone has a right to voice how wildlife should be managed here in the United States. And so that's something that is important that I hope you can take away from this. Now really quick to explain who manages wildlife in the United States. You need to go back to your early American history and think back to the US Constitution's 10th Amendment. When the founding fathers were getting together, when they were organizing a government of how to regulate laws and manage peoples here in this new founded nation, they weren't really thinking about wildlife. It wasn't something that they were concerned with while they were writing out the Constitution. But in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, we had inscribed the powers in the Constitution that are not delegated to the United States and not prohibited to it by the states are reserved for the states respectively, or to the people. So to put that into a more digestible phrase, anything that is not going to be regulated or managed by the federal government will be managed respectively by state governments. So in the United States, you have the federal government, and then you have 50 different states. Each state has a state government or a local government that is responsible for managing and governing a myriad of things. And one of those things is wildlife, because wildlife was not specifically mentioned in the Constitution as something that would be managed by the federal government. It is therefore managed by the state governments. So states have the responsibility to manage wildlife on behalf of the public, unless otherwise stated. We'll get back to this in a second. So suddenly, after our Declaration of Independence here in the United States, we have different territories, we have different colonies, we have eventually states that are being established, and we recognize as a young nation that all citizens have a right to natural resources. They have a right to go out and to hunt and to live off of the land, which is something that many Euro-Americans had not had the opportunity or the privilege to do in the old world, especially in cities or in places where magistrates or monarchs had the authority to utilize wildlife or appreciate wildlife, but it was denied of the commons to appreciate or utilize those same resources. Suddenly here in the United States, anyone could live off the land. Anyone could be a landowner. And all you needed if you wanted to get fresh game or fresh meat to feed your family was a weapon, a rifle. You could go off and you could shoot as many animals as you wanted. Tragically, because there was unrestricted hunting and soon commercial greed and lots of monopolies trying to capitalize off of this abundance of wildlife that we had here in North America, we nearly wiped out most of our large megafaunal species. Bison is the premier example. We had probably 30 million buffalo ranging across North America, and within several decades we had annihilated almost all of them. We got down just to a few thousand was all that was left. Pronghorn was the same. You also had elk populations decimated, deer populations decimated. And all of this was because of hide hunters or commercial enterprises and unrestricted hunting that was taking place all across North America. And it really became severe in the American West. The American West was perhaps the last area you could argue in the continental United States that was settled and had a government system of statehood. And so because of basically no regulation, a lot of our wildlife populations collapsed, or at least became near to collapsing. After your herbivores were wiped out, your carnivores then became targeted. Your wolf population was eradicated, your grizzly bear population was crippled, your cougars became nearly eradicated as well. Now, as wildlife was decimated all across the United States, the remaining individuals that were hiding out in protected lands became subject to poaching. This is a famous photograph taken in Yellowstone National Park. All of these tragically decapitated bison heads were confiscated from poachers who were sneaking into Yellowstone National Park and were shooting the last remaining buffalo that we had in the continental United States. And these are the military that had come in and had confiscated these heads. But a lot of laws and regulations to restrict poaching or to punish poaching weren't actually implemented until quite late, to the turn of the century. And so again, you have a lot of wildlife crimes, a lot of naivete and participation in the decimation of wildlife populations that was not fully appreciated or punishable until late in the game. And now I'd like to introduce one of our main champions of wildlife management here in the modern age, Theodore Roosevelt, who was a president of the United States. He is a very charismatic individual. If you're familiar with Theodore Roosevelt, he did a lot for conservation. He was really the father of modern land conservation. He was born at the end of a generation where the frontier in the West was still the frontier, and he recognized that a lot of the lands that he wanted to see preserved as wild were being destroyed. He also was an aristocrat, and he had the luxury of being a big game hunter. He was trained as a naturalist. He attended Harvard and trained and studied ornithology there. He had a unique way of appreciating wildlife, and I'm speaking to an audience of wildlife lovers. That's where you're tuned in today, listening to this presentation. And there's sometimes a little bit of a disconnect between how people appreciated wildlife at the turn of the century, when wildlife was viewed as a source of utilitarian gain, or a resource that could be appreciated but also consumed. And today we're kind of moving away from that in popular consensus. Most of us are not actually out hunting for subsistence reasons. Instead, we're appreciating wildlife with cameras and binoculars. Theodore Roosevelt, though, he was someone who was concerned at seeing the Wild West vanish. He was concerned about seeing wild lands disappear. So he became influential in creating national monuments, national parks. He set aside over 200 million acres in public lands during his administration. He's done more for conservation in that aspect than any other president before or after. And he also did a lot for wildlife in general. And he was frustrated that people were capitalizing off of wildlife, which belonged to the public at large. And he thought that these people were greedy and selfish. And he recognized that if their consumption of wildlife did not go checked, that we would soon see the extinction of deer and elk and buffalo and bears, etc. And so this is a quote from one of his speeches that he gave regarding wildlife management. And I know it's long, but I think in order to put all of this into context, it's important that I read all of this to you. So Theodore Roosevelt said, "Defenders of the short-sighted men who in their greed and selfishness will, if permitted, rob our country of half its charm by their reckless extermination of all useful and beautiful wild things, sometimes seek to champion them by saying that the game belongs to the people. So it does, and not merely to the people now alive, but to the unborn people. The greatest good for the greatest number applies to the number within the womb of time, compared to which those now alive form but an insignificant fraction. Our duty to the whole, including the unborn generations, bids us to restrain an unprincipled present-day minority from wasting the heritage of these unborn generations. The movement for the conservation of wildlife and the larger movement for the conservation of all our natural resources are essentially democratic in spirit, purpose, and method." So to paraphrase, Theodore Roosevelt realized that, sure, in the United States, wildlife belongs to everyone, but people who are greedy and are seeking to exploit these resources for personal gain are going to deprive not only their peers, but untold numbers of future generations who would otherwise profit and benefit from having wildlife on the landscape. So Theodore Roosevelt really got the ball rolling, and he really pushed hard for the protection and regulation of wildlife hunting and protection. So beginning in the 1870s, remember I mentioned under the 10th Amendment of the US Constitution, state wildlife agencies were established. They were created to protect and regulate wildlife populations. Now in the 1870s and in the 1880s, the science of wildlife conservation was not what it is today. So we can't really hold the 1890s, 1880s wildlife management procedures of that day to the same standard that we have for our wildlife management today. The term ecology was not even coined until the 1930s, and so there was not a lot of appreciation for biodiversity. Predators, for example, were still very much hated and feared. Nevertheless, every state eventually developed its own wildlife agency. So whatever state you're living in today, you have a wildlife agency. They all go by different names. You have Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. You have the Florida Conservation Commission, Utah's Wildlife Resources. All of these different agencies, however, are responsible for managing the wildlife in the state boundaries for the public. So I want you to realize that. I think most people don't appreciate that or realize that. Wildlife is managed in the United States by state governments for the benefit of the public. Today's public as well as tomorrow's public. Theodore Roosevelt wasn't done in pushing his agenda to protect wildlife. Again, he was a famous big game hunter, but he also was a naturalist, and in his day he was considered a biologist as well. And he pushed really hard to go up and beyond the status quo of his generation, and just marching out onto the landscape and shooting up wildlife for pleasure or for personal consumption or personal profit. So he said, wildlife and its habitat cannot speak, so we must and we will. He got together with some of his peers, again, these Euro-American white males who were of an aristocracy and had the luxury to go out on big hunts, and they created the Boone and Crockett Club. They also were the founding fathers of the North American model of wildlife conservation. This model is premier among all other wildlife models across the world. North America, including Canada, so the United States and Canada, utilize this model of wildlife conservation, and basically it's a code of principles or ethics that was established, and we today adhere to these 7 points to direct us in our decisions of wildlife management, as well as consumption and conservation. So I'll quickly go over these 7 different principles that were established by Theodore Roosevelt and his contemporaries. 1, wildlife is a public trust managed for the benefit of all citizens. 2, there should be an elimination of commercial markets for wild game. So that is in effect today. That's how we operate. There is no commercial market for wild game. If you go to the store, you can't buy venison that someone shot out in the wild. You can't buy a buffalo burger that is harvested from a buffalo that was shot out in Utah or Montana. If you do buy venison or elk at a restaurant or buffalo, those have been harvested off of a farm. So they're farmed animals, they're not wild animals. 3, laws are developed by citizens and enforced by the government. 4, there's opportunity for all, which means that every citizen has the freedom to view, hunt, and fish, regardless of social or economic status. It's pretty revolutionary if you think about it. This was put together in the early 1900s, but this argument that everyone has the privilege to enjoy wildlife, regardless of their upbringing or their background. 5, wildlife cannot be killed casually, but only for a legitimate purpose as defined by law. So it is unethical, according to this model, it is unethical to kill animals just for fun. 6, wildlife is an international resource because wildlife migrates across political boundaries. 7, science is the proper basis for wildlife policy and management, not opinion or conjecture. So in order for us to continue to protect wildlife, it was recognized that science has to be the leading authority on wildlife management and conservation. Now, people generally today are transitioning out of this consumptive or a traditional stakeholder status. But to begin with, when the country was first getting started, and especially when wildlife management was being initiated for the first time at the end of the 18th century, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, hunting was the premier way that people experienced wildlife. And because the North American model for wildlife conservation was set up during this day and age, a lot of the wording and a lot of the modeling still adheres to hunting or consumptive practices. And this is why hunting is so important to wildlife conservation, because of these early efforts taken by Theodore Roosevelt and his contemporaries. If you're unfamiliar, all wildlife management and research is sponsored and funded by the sale of hunting licenses and fishing licenses. So wildlife professionals, wildlife biologists working in your state, whether it be Ohio or North Dakota or wherever, your wildlife biologists are getting their funding, they're employed because of the sale of hunting licenses and fishing licenses. Also, in 1937, the Pittman-Robertson Act was employed, which provides funding for the restoration and improvement of wildlife habitat for wildlife management and research. So funds for this act come from an 11% federal excise tax on sporting arms, ammunition, and archery equipment, as well as 10% tax on handguns. So when people go out and they buy firearms, when they buy archery equipment or ammunition, there is a tax that is federally regulated that takes this money, this tax, and it goes directly to wildlife conservation and protection. So even though today a lot of people ask me if they do not have a hunting background, why do hunters have such a loud voice in wildlife conservation? Why do we have wildlife agencies that really cater to, or it seems like listen to hunters and fishermen? Well, it's because even though they are a minority today, these hunters and these anglers shoulder almost entirely the funding burden or the financial burden for sponsoring wildlife conservation and management. So biologists who even are interested in researching pika or are interested in researching otters or species that are not elk or consumed regularly, these species are still funded, their research is funded by sportsmen and women. In 1934, the Federal Migratory Bird Hunting and Conservation Stamp was enacted. So this is the duck stamp, requiring all people who want to go out and hunt waterfowl are required to get a license or a duck stamp, and 98 cents to every dollar that is spent goes directly to the purchase of vital habitat to acquire conservation easements within the National Wildlife Refuge System. So again, in this early system in the 1900s, it was primarily hunters and fishermen who were enjoying wildlife or were appreciating wildlife. And so it made sense to incorporate their involvement by taxing their sport to protect wildlife and to ensure that wildlife was thoroughly studied and conservation was thoroughly enacted. Now, this is interesting because today in the 21st century, the hunting community is smaller than ever, and it's still shrinking. But that burden of funding wildlife conservation and biology in the United States has not really shifted. It still is very much borne by the sportsmen and women who are participating in these consumptive outdoor pastimes. I also should mention Aldo Leopold, who is considered the prophet of wildlife management or the father of modern wildlife management, who grew up during this time and was a traditional hunter and was known popularly for his broad understanding of ecosystems and the appreciation of ecology. He really began to push for a holistic sense of nature and wildlife management. As a young man, he participated in hunting wolves and uprooting all predators off of the landscape because the belief was if you had no wolves, you'd have more deer, and that is exactly what we wanted. We wanted more hunting opportunities. But as he matured, as he got older, he began to understand that predators played a part of the land, part of the ecosystem's role as well, and they were essential to keeping the environment healthy. So he really became the forefather of looking beyond just consumptive conservation, and he began to appreciate the environment and the ecosystem as a whole. Now, I've mentioned that all states have an authority to manage and monitor their wildlife respectively, but there is, of course, the federal government, and the federal government has the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This Fish and Wildlife Service is important because they enforce federal wildlife laws. So in the beginning, we had the public trust doctrine, we had wildlife regulation by individual states, but it wasn't too far into the 20th century that we began to realize that wildlife migrate. We need to also realize, and we began to realize and appreciate, that wildlife can become endangered or can go extinct. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as an authority, a federal government authority, became the autonomy that enforced federal wildlife laws, including protecting endangered species, managing migratory birds, conserving and restoring wildlife habitat. And they also work with other governments in enforcing international conservation efforts, and they also distribute money to states that are this money taken from taxes from the sale of ammunition and firearms, etc., for the conservation of wildlife. So while states manage wildlife at large, if a species becomes imperiled, for example, or becomes federally protected, then no longer does the state have authority to manage that species by itself. Suddenly it becomes a national concern, and the federal government steps in. So there are really 5 big federal acts that we're going to talk about here, where the federal government has more authority in protecting the wildlife than the state does. The first one is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So early on in the 20th century, it was argued that birds migrate. And so how can you have the state of Colorado manage birds that are flying over to Wyoming? Clearly, these birds are migrating, and so you need to have federal authority protecting birds that are migrating. So you still have that today. Birds that are of a migratory nature are protected by the federal government. In the 1940s, you had the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. So this kind of extends as an umbrella to all birds of prey and raptors. So they are federally protected. Then we had the very controversial 1971 Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. We're not going to get into this here, but it is controversial because horses and burros are not native to North America. These strains aren't. Of course, historically we had wild horses during the Pleistocene, but anyway, it's controversial. But wild horses and burros are protected federally, so the states don't manage them. And then the Marine Mammals Protection Act of 1972, marine mammals became protected and regulated by the federal government. And then the most famous and the most powerful is the Endangered Species Act of 1973. So the federal law recognized that species can go endangered, they can become imperiled, at that event, it's important for the federal government to step in and to protect the species at large. Once a species is recovered, once it's no longer threatened or imperiled, then management goes back to the states. Now, in the 70s, less traditional stakeholders began to emerge from the weeds, and they began to have a desire to participate in conservation and wildlife management. And this is when you have a lot of your non-government organizations really taking root and becoming very powerful. Some of these had emerged much earlier, but really in the 1960s, 70s, and until today, they have a large presence on the world of conservation. But they're non-government organizations. They're interested in the preservation and conservation of natural resources like wildlife, but they don't manage wildlife. They are not the governments responsible for managing wildlife. Of course, the World Wildlife Fund with Natural Habitat Adventures is involved with that, the Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy. You also have other groups, more grassroots groups, and as well as larger international groups. But these programs are, they accept or depend on donations generated by the public to push conservation agendas that they think are important. And it's great to have them around because they are the watchdogs and they do a lot of work to help protect wildlife. So I work specifically with wolves up in Yellowstone, where I did my graduate research, and I continue to work up there with the Yellowstone Wolf Project. I think the gray wolf is an excellent example of how wildlife is managed in the West and how wildlife is managed in the United States. And so I've made a short case study of gray wolves in the northern Rocky Mountains in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho to talk about how wolves are managed and how their evolution of wildlife management has taken place. So gray wolves, really quickly, they once historically roamed all across North America. Approximately 2 million gray wolves lived all across North America, going down through Mexico, all the way up through the Arctic and Canada and Alaska. But as Euro-Americans began to push westward, they extirpated wolves because of many different reasons. If you're wanting to learn more about that, you can watch the wolf presentation I gave for natural habitat. But essentially, wolf populations were decimated, and wolves became regionally protected by the Endangered Species Act in 1974. So here on this map, you have today's current range of where wolves are living, as well as their historic range. Wolves had basically gone extinct in the continental United States. So the lower 48 states had no wolves by the 1970s, with the exception of a small population on the Minnesota-Canadian border. Because of that, we decided to fix that. That's what the Endangered Species Act was created for. Wolves were not endangered globally. In fact, the populations throughout Canada, Alaska, and Siberia were doing quite well, but historically, they were here in the lower 48 states, and we got rid of them all. And we recognized that that was wrong, that was unethical, and so we decided that it would be good to restore them, to reintroduce them to areas where they used to live. So when the species became listed as endangered, or in this case, they were an experimental population or a threatened population is what they were listed as, the federal government stepped in to take authority over managing the population. So oftentimes people think about Yellowstone National Park's wolf reintroduction, and they assume that it was the National Park Service that participated in that reintroduction. That's not the case. It wasn't the National Park Service, nor was it Idaho, Montana, or Wyoming. It was the federal government, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that created the Northern Rocky Mountain Gray Wolf Recovery Plan. And in 1995 and 1996, they went up to British Columbia and Alberta and captured 66 wolves and brought them down into central Idaho and into Yellowstone National Park and released them. So wolves have since been doing fantastic in the Northern Rocky Mountains. A little bit about their biology. They are very fecund. They reproduce quickly. And wolves are so prolific that populations can increase at a mean rate of 20% every year. So even though we reintroduced them in the mid-90s, by the mid-2000s, the wolf recovery targets were met. So wolves had reached a number in the Northern Rocky Mountains where it was recommended by the Fish and Wildlife Service that they be delisted and management be transferred back to the states. Lawsuits went back and forth, and it wasn't until a congressional directive in 2011 that wolves in Montana and Idaho were delisted. And no longer were they protected by the Endangered Species Act, but they were to be managed by those two states respectively. And in 2017, wolves in Wyoming were delisted. So that's how it works, and that was a fantastic example of how the Endangered Species Act and wildlife management in the West can be effective. You had a population that became imperiled, so the federal government stepped in to help see its rebound or its recovery, and then once it reached recovery, once it was no longer considered to be imperiled, management switched back to the states. And how the state manages its wildlife population is up to the state citizens. Now, this is where it gets ugly. I just painted you a very simplistic picture of the Northern Rocky Mountain wolf population recovery program. Obviously, nothing is simple with wolves. Everything is very contentious. The difficulty of coexisting with wildlife is less about the wildlife than it is about us and our values. As you can imagine, when wolf reintroduction was on the table, or even today, where we're still dealing with wolves, People have opinions, and it can be very near impossible to change people's opinions and their world values. People value different things. Some hunters might value deer more than they value the wolf, and some people might value their livestock more than they value the wolf. And some people don't live and profit from a lifestyle that would necessarily be impacted how carnivores on the landscape could impact them. And so it becomes very contentious. So this is what I want everyone to pay attention to. Every single state has a wildlife management board or a committee or a council. So every state in the United States has a system where the public can voice how they want to see their wildlife managed. I find it embarrassing how few citizens of the United States, especially people who are invested in nature and in wildlife, do not understand how the system works. It's shameful, and it's not your fault if you didn't know this. It's the fault of the agencies. We need to do a better job of telling the public that the wildlife belongs to them. And you as a citizen have a voice. Generally, several times a year, 6 or 7 times a year, your wildlife agency in your state will host a meeting. And on that meeting, you have a panel of citizens representing different stakeholder groups, whether it be hunters, whether it be non-consumptive or environmentalists, whether it be just the public at large or the agricultural departments and businesses. A committee gets together and they listen to what you, the public, has to say about wildlife management and specifically about topics of that meeting. They get together, they listen, and then they present what the public wants to a board elected usually by the legislature of your state. And the state legislature and those wildlife board members will then determine, based on the science and based on the public demand or the public's desire, how wildlife should be managed. So I'm going to emphasize this again at the end of my presentation, but this is something that everyone can participate in. Understand, though, that wildlife management can be very complex and it can be very political. Again, not everyone agrees on the same thing, and because of that, people can become very impassioned and they can become very sensitive about how wildlife is managed. Some people don't like the idea of any animal being hunted at all, and I can respect that and appreciate that. And some people think that all animals should be hunted and should be able to be consumed. And I can respect that view as well. But here at these meetings, you have a very democratic opportunity to participate in your state's wildlife management. But ultimately, the greatest challenge of wildlife management is struggling with people who don't agree with each other and have conflicting values and beliefs. So this is where wildlife professionals and science comes in. So again, I work as a biologist, and we manage large carnivore populations up in the Yellowstone area, and we study populations of different species all over the West. I should have mentioned earlier that almost all of these photos I've taken on my different adventures, but biologists are hired by the states, or wildlife professionals are hired by the states to manage and to conduct research on wildlife populations. And the dimensions of wildlife management are basically broken into 3 categories. 1, humans; 2, wildlife; and 3, habitat. Humans is first, which is pretty ironic, but we always joke in wildlife management that you're not actually managing wildlife, you're managing people. You're managing humans and their different opinions. Second, you're trying to study the animals, you're trying to protect the animals. And thirdly, of course, you need to protect their habitat. Now, again, I mentioned this at the beginning of our talk, but wildlife management sounds pretty hands-on, which can be uncomfortable for some people. But the reality is, in this 21st century, as tragic as it may sound, that humans dominate the earth. So wildlife depend on our ability to make decisions that do not compromise their existence. We live at a time when we can't be hands-off for most of our wildlife populations. We have to be participating in conservation. Otherwise, if we become apathetic, species might go extinct. So without serious attention to the management of wildlife, life as we know will cease to exist because human civilization can destroy it. We have become so prolific on the landscape. Our demands on natural resources are so great that we have to be concerned with monitoring and researching and regulating our wildlife populations. So Aldo Leopold took Roosevelt's North American model of wildlife conservation, basically condensed it into what is called the Roosevelt Doctrine. These are 3 principles that we as wildlife professionals try and adhere to. 1, all natural resources, including wildlife, are one integral whole. So we have to appreciate not just one particular species of wildlife, but the ecosystem at large. 2, conservation through wise use is a public responsibility, and ownership of wildlife is a public trust. So the community at large, you are the owners of wildlife. As anthropocentric as that may sound, consider it a huge privilege that you have the ability to argue in favor for the protection and conservation of wildlife. And it's up to the agencies to follow what the public demands of it. 3, science is the proper tool for discharging that responsibility. So science, not opinion, science is how we should proceed with wildlife conservation and management. So the goals of wildlife management can be broken down into 4 general categories. 1 goal is to increase a particular population of wildlife as long as it is done for endangered and threatened species and others that have unhealthy populations. So as wildlife professionals, one of our goals is to help increase the populations of imperiled species. The species that are struggling, it is our ethical obligation as managers to try and help that species recover. A second general goal is to reduce populations that are above management goals or are detrimental to other populations. There's this simplified concept or misconception, I guess, that that nature is in a perfect balance, that everything works out brilliantly. That might be the case on a large scale, but in today's world where we have a lot of human encroachment and habitat loss of wildlife species, it's essential for us to be proactive and in some cases reduce populations that are negatively impacting other wildlife populations. Mountain goats that are non-native to Grand Teton National Park are currently being extirpated from the park because they're negatively impacting bighorn sheep. So this is one of those examples. We have to be proactive in protecting species that are struggling. A third goal is to be able to harvest the population and yet maintain a sustainable yield, as is the case for most huntable species. So hunting regulations are generally very conservative because biologists want to ensure that wildlife populations are not decimated. People, whether you do or not, people like to hunt and they like to consume and participate in this sustained harvest of a wild crop, you could say. I don't expect everyone to be comfortable with that, but I think it's important to recognize that that's how some people live, and some people do it for sustainable purposes. Less so in our first world country, but it's important for us to recognize that around the world, people do subsist on wild game meat, and it's up to biologists to make sure that we are managing those populations that are being harvested correctly. So we have to watch those populations closely. The fourth goal is to generally do nothing for a population except for monitoring it over time. National parks are a great example of this because national parks are federally regulated lands where we don't participate in hunting and we don't do anything except for study and watch wildlife. We research, we learn how ecosystems can unfold over time. So as biologists, we have to learn from the natural world too. We don't just do everything hands-on. That's something that we're learning absolutely. Wildlife management is more about human management. Again, I became a wildlife professional because I thought everyone liked animals and that it would be a safe very non-political profession to become involved in. And boy, was I wrong. Wildlife is extremely political. People have opinions, people have worldviews, and it can be challenging as a wildlife professional to hear different perspectives, but it can also be enlightening too. I don't have all the answers, and I think anyone who says they have all the answers is to be mistrusted. So it's important for all of us to collaborate together and to work and navigate values and perceptions that are sometimes unlikely to change, even regardless of how good the science and the data is. Really quickly, I'll move through this, but here in the American West, we have historically had a low human presence on the landscape, but all of that is changing. Our populations have doubled in the last 50 years. Our national parks, our gateway communities are bigger than most eastern cities, or coastal cities, as we like to say. So even though we might still have rural communities, the influx of tourism, although not economically bad, can be devastating to the fragmentation of habitat for wildlife. Our cities, our subdivisions are growing at such a rapid rate that it's threatening the existence of some of the remaining megafaunal populations that we have here in North America. And we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to proceed into the future with wildlife conservation? And as more people spread their footprints across the American West, we have to recognize that we're going to encroach on wildlife's habitat. And we have to ask the tough questions. Is it okay to have wildlife in your neighborhood? Should your neighborhood be there? Yes or no? How are you going to behave in your neighborhood if your neighborhood exists and you have wildlife? If it's not okay to have deer in your neighborhood eating your vegetables, then it's also not okay to have predators in your neighborhood. Predators require much more land. They require a larger range than herbivores do. And where do we draw the boundaries around where it's okay to have carnivores and where it's not okay to have carnivores? These are difficult questions. And we have to also accept that as we are experiencing this hyper development of the American West, as more people are getting out into the foothills, as they're recreating, as our urban sprawl takes over the last of the frontier, if you want to call it, there's a price of coexistence. And are we willing to keep wildlife wild at the cost or at the expense of our comforts, or are we willing to let things change and change rapidly? Again, going back to predators, which is what I research and study, wildlife is wild. Wildlife can be dangerous, and large carnivores can be dangerous around people. Although the probability of predation on a human is minuscule, the danger increases the more people encroach on wildlife habitat. And habituation can quickly lead to an animal's death. As wilderness shrinks, it's important to recognize that capture and relocation are not realistic solutions. This is a cougar that I picked up on the side of the road that was hit by a car. You can't just move an animal that's in a neighborhood and put it in wilderness when wilderness is shrinking, and when a wolf can travel 500 miles in a year, or a bear can travel 300 miles in 6 months. Where are you going to put these animals if they get into trouble, where they're not going to get into trouble again? So these are the difficult questions that wildlife managers have to consider. To wrap up, I just want to encourage everyone that you, especially those of you who are American citizens listening in on this topic today, you need to recognize that you can be involved. That thanks to our system of government, wildlife is a public trust resource that belongs to everyone. And your state agencies are responsible for managing wildlife populations according to your wishes. I want to encourage you to contact your local state wildlife agency, to get on their website and to find out when they have their wildlife management meetings. Now with COVID-19, it can't be easier, because if we didn't have COVID-19, you might have to drive an hour or two to attend these meetings. But now almost all of our meetings are being held online, and you can sit in the comfort of your home. You can listen, you can learn. Listen to how the biologists are presenting the information, investigate the science, and participate in the discussions. This is the time in the United States where we're getting ready to vote for our next president. I'm also encouraging you to become involved politically with your wildlife, its management and its conservation. So thank you guys very much. I know that I went a little bit longer than I was supposed to, Kendall, but thanks for having me.
That is just fine. You did a wonderful job. Thank you so much, Aaron. We do have some great questions for you, so I'd like to get into that. But first, if you have a question for Aaron, for those watching, I'd like to invite you to submit those in the control panel under the questions field. Okay, first question I want to get to right away in case folks need to leave. How can people find out when and where their state's wildlife agencies meetings are held?
So first, if you don't know, learn what the name of your state wildlife agency is. Again, every state has a different name, but usually if you're in Pennsylvania, you just type in Pennsylvania Fish and Game Agency, and it'll pop up, whatever its name might be. And you can either call your nearest office and find out when the meetings are, or on their website, you should be able to navigate it. Hopefully you can navigate it easily, but you should be able to find out when their meetings are. Typically, there's 6 to 7 meetings a year for most states.
Okay, great. There were a lot of questions about wolves and their reintroduction into different areas of the U.S. Someone asked about Lower Peninsula of Michigan. Someone asked about the Adirondacks. And there was someone who specifically asked about Colorado's Proposition 114, and if you would make a comment on that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm primarily a wolf biologist. I work with wolves, so I have a lot of experience with them. You can look at the wolf presentations I've made for Natural Habitat previously. Wolves were reintroduced into the northern Rocky Mountains, the Yellowstone area, and central Idaho because of its remoteness. So even though wolves lived everywhere in the lower 48 states prior to Euro-American settlement, we elected to reintroduce them into a remote part of the American West because that's where they would have food. Number one, there's a lot of elk and deer for them to eat. And two, the human populations were relatively small. You can't imagine reintroducing wolves into Los Angeles today or into New York City today just because their habitat and their food source is gone. So there have been proposals to reintroduce wolves elsewhere. We did in 1998 reintroduce wolves into the Southwest. It was a subspecies of the gray wolf, the Mexican gray wolf, and that population is now in Mexico and in Arizona, New Mexico and Arizona. As far as the Midwest goes, if you can recall, I mentioned that all of our wolves in the 48 states were extirpated by the 1970s, except for a small population up by Voyager National Park on the Canada-Minnesota border. The population there has since grown to almost 5,000 wolves that now range throughout Michigan as well as Minnesota. There's a famous population on Isle Royale National Park. Today, actually this next month, the state of Colorado is including on their ballot an initiative for reintroduction of wolves into the state of Colorado. So they would capture wolves probably from Idaho or Montana, and they would reintroduce them into the state of Colorado in the next 3 years. This is really interesting because, and it ties in with our discussion today, because this is a state initiative. So whereas most wildlife populations that are federally protected and in Colorado, because there isn't a viable wolf population, wolves are still considered an endangered species there. It is not the federal government that is planning this reintroduction. It is the state's public at large. So Coloradans are deciding if they want their state government to reintroduce wolves into the state of Colorado within the next 3 years. It's a very democratic process. It's fantastic. We'll see if it happens or not. As a biologist, I would like to see them recolonize naturally. That's my personal opinion. Wolves do come down into Colorado occasionally. I'm not sure how long it would take for a viable population to establish a permanent population in Colorado. It might be a year, might be 100 years from now. So that is a concern. How long are we willing to wait?
Great. Okay, and since wolves migrate between states, does that pose any complications as they're still managed by states and not the federal government?
It does, actually. Wolves were born to walk. Wolves are really good at walking. It's not a big deal for a wolf to walk 500 miles in a year. So wolves in Yellowstone National Park, where they're protected by the federal government, if they leave Yellowstone into Montana or Idaho or Wyoming, there is the potential that they could be trapped or shot. Those three states, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, manage their wolf population with hunting and trapping. They don't have to do that, but that's something that they've decided to do. So when a species becomes delisted, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be hunted right away or that they will ever be hunted, but that's how Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming decided that they would manage their wolf population. So there's the threat of them walking outside of Yellowstone and being shot or trapped. And that goes vice versa. If a wolf were to leave Montana when the wolf hunting season is not on and go into Idaho where the wolf hunting season is on, that obviously would be detrimental to that individual. If any of those wolves were to leave and go down to Colorado where wolves are still protected, or other parts of the country where wolves are still protected, then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would be called in to monitor that individual, most likely, or that small pack that is moving outside of where they're federally or where they're managed by the states, and they would be called to manage and monitor those roaming wolves.
All right. And someone wants to know if there are any ideas to expand the burden for financing wildlife conservation beyond hunters and anglers.
I'm really glad someone asked that question. There's a lot of talk today in our world about funding wildlife biology and wildlife conservation and wildlife research. 3.6% of Americans identify as being hunters. That's a small percentage that is shouldering the burden of wildlife conservation. Obviously, people who are not hunters but are still involved in wildlife conservation can donate money to nonprofits or to non-government organizations like the World Wildlife Fund. But where wildlife non-consumptive recreation is growing, we've had a 20% increase in the last 5 years of people who want to get out and view wildlife but not necessarily hunt wildlife. I think that someday we're going to have to see that financial burden shift, that we can't expect hunters and anglers to continue to fund all of the research and the biology and the conservation. I think too, if you suddenly have non-consumptive people, bird watchers, for example, at the table who are helping finance these conservation initiatives, you're suddenly going to have a more diverse and dynamic discussion at the table. There probably would be less discussion about hunting and tags and permits and licenses, and there'd probably be more discussion about protecting tree stands that are sensitive to bird species, et cetera, et cetera. That's just an example. There have been, but not seriously, there have been discussions about taxing recreational equipment, like taxing mountain bikes or binoculars or backpacks or hiking shoes. Personally, I think that's a fantastic idea. Of course, no one wants to pay taxes, and so there's a lot of pushback whenever those ideas are brought up. But wow, walk into an REI store or anything like that, and the equipment there is phenomenal, and it would be fantastic to, if I can say this as my own opinion, it'd be fantastic to put a small moderate tax on buying something like a compass or a map, as long as that's going to the conservation of wildlife. That's a great idea.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to end on this question. What is your biggest victory or your favorite accomplishment in wildlife management?
Oh man, that's tough. I really like to celebrate two things. I'll make them really quick. One, I think the reintroduction of the gray wolf to the northern Rocky Mountains. My family's been out of Yellowstone for 7 generations. I get a lot of diverse opinions at my Sunday dinners about wolves. They're very controversial, but wow, what a fantastic recovery story. Wolves are no longer endangered in the northern Rockies. People still talk a lot about them. People are concerned about the liberal hunting and trapping seasons in Idaho and Montana and Wyoming, and there's a lot of discussion about that, and I think those are viable concerns. But as far as the biology of the species, wolves are doing great as a population. Another really cool success story is grizzly bears. Grizzly bears in the lower 48 states, their population collapsed. They were listed as an endangered species in 1975, and we have been pushing to get them delisted for the last decade. The population is at carrying capacity, and in my opinion, they should be delisted. But the fact that we went from having fewer than 200 grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem to now probably 1,000 grizzly bears, when this species, unlike the wolf, reproduces so slowly. It's so difficult to get the population to come back. Wolves, they're like rabbits. They breed really easy. Their successful recovery has more to do with them and their biology than it has to do with us. But the grizzly bear, I think, really took a lot of intensive management, closing sensitive areas to the public's access, rethinking how we're grazing livestock, being bear aware, taking out our garbage and our trash, protecting our foods and smellables from curious bears. The grizzly bear is a really, really big success story that we've seen in the last half century.
All right, well, great. Thank you so much, Aaron. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Thank you guys very much for participating today. There's a lot of information. I didn't think I would end up talking as much as I did, but I really want you to take away this notion that the wildlife is a part of the landscape, and we are managers, whether we realize it or not. It's fantastic to be involved with groups like Natural Habitat Adventures and the World Wildlife Fund that do so much as non-government organizations to protect these species and their habitats. However, I encourage you to become more involved at a local level and participate in wildlife management by going directly to your local authorities. And it might be difficult at first. It might be frustrating to figure out the political workings of how everything works out, but really learn what's happening in your neighborhood, learn what's happening in your state, and protect wildlife. I'd love to see some more biodiversity across the country. That'd be great.
Thank you, Aaron. Your passion is evident and your enthusiasm is contagious. So thank you so much for presenting for us today. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.